Welcome, folks. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really looking forward to hosting tonight's event with Erica Lagalisse about her latest work, Occult Features of Anarchism, with attention to the conspiracy of kings and the conspiracy of the peoples. For folks joining an event with us for the first time, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 13-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on occupied Cherokee territory. Our bookstore features a wide selection of general interest titles and political thought, highlighting queer, feminist, and anarchist voices in culture. And our entire catalog is available online. So if you haven't checked us out yet, I'll drop links to the website in the chat. Firestorm is also an event space that hosts workshops, film screenings, and presentations, as well as meetings for various grassroots community organizations. Since the start of the pandemic, we transitioned to an online virtual space and will likely continue with virtual events like this through the end of the year. Today's event was also organized in collaboration with our friends at PM Press. We've been collaborating on a series of events with PM Press since the start of 2021 and have a few more events on the schedule throughout July and August. Notably, a week from today, on July 29th, we're hosting an event titled Women's Resistance in South Africa with the author and illustrator of Crossroads, I Live Where I Like, a graphic history. It is a really wonderful graphic history on women's resistance in Cape Town in South Africa. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure to follow us on social media, as well as our website's community calendar, which I will also drop links to in the chat. And thanks again to PM Press for collaborating on tonight's event. One last note, there will be some time at the end of the event for audience Q&A. We'll be listening to a 45-minute presentation that Erica made in 2020. And for folks who are attending through Zoom, I'll encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. And Erica will join us after the recording and do her best to respond to any questions submitted. Well, great. Like I said before, we're here tonight to hear about Erica's Occult Features of Anarchism, with attention to the conspiracy of kings and the conspiracy of the peoples. Erica is an anthropologist and writer who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the International Inequalities Institute in the London School of Economics and Political Science, where she is conducting a research project on class dynamics surrounding conspiracy theory in left social movement spaces. Occult Features of Anarchism, published last year by PM Press, comments on the cultural production of conspiracy theory while presenting a historical study exploring the gendered cosmology of the modern left and offering in its place an anti-colonial critique of anarchism. It's a small book that covers a lot of ground and the layers just kind of keep peeling off. So if you've not checked it out yet, I think there's a lot to learn that is relevant to folks who find themselves hanging out in leftist and anarchist circles. And if you've not had a chance to pick up the book, I will also drop links to it in the chat. Well, cool. Erica, thank you so much for being here tonight and taking the time to offer us this dialogue. And I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Ash. Thank you for such a generous introduction. I'll try to speak as slowly and clearly as you do. It's a challenge for me. And yes, I wanted to say hello to everyone, especially because we will be presenting a recording of a talk. And so before we do that, I want to say hello to everyone and to let you all know that I am here and I'm listening. And if you do want to get a chance to talk to me live or ask me any specific questions, please do afterwards, and we can have a bit of a discussion. Yeah, just thanks in general for inviting me. Thank you, Ash. Thank you to the bookshop. And I do want to emphasize that I'm happy to do the event because I'm about to say something on social media that goes something. I've been scripting it in my head. It's going to be something like, to anyone, I still owe a reply for invitation for an online event and I haven't replied, please don't take it personally. It's just that I'd rather, I get Q-tips shoved up my nose and jabbed with needles, be turned into a CRISPR machine and interact with hostile border personnel and fly, risking multiple causes of death to your city, sleep on an unheated squat floor for no honorarium, then do another online book event. Because it's just a general feeling. It's not because of any experience we have tonight. It's just a sign of the times. So it probably will be my last online event for a little while. I'm going to take a break, but I am very happy to be here. And thank you, Ash. And everyone, please do humor the fact that we are using a recording of the main talk, and feel free to ask me questions after. Thank you.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, Erica. Well, knowing that, it's a real honor to be hosting tonight. Okay, so for folks in the audience, I am going to share my screen. There'll be a nice graphic that we use to promote tonight's event, and I will play the recording. And like I said at the start, it lasts about 45 minutes. If you've got questions that come up for you at any point during the presentation, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. And then we will come back to have a bit of a discussion. Did you have something you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I want to add a little bit of ethnographic information about the recording, just to let people know. This is a recording of a talk that I did at Freedom Books in London just before the pandemic hit, like in February 2020. I wanted to, so you'll be amused to hear people coughing in the audience. It was like back when you could do that. And also wanted to say, for the sake of it, that it has been edited a bit. It's a talk that I did in an anarchist bookshop, and there was a bit of audience back and forth and participation in it. And so we have removed everyone's participation and voice, from the recording that was there, except for the person who presented and introduced me. And just so that everyone understands that it's basically an authentic recording, but it has been edited a bit for reasons of confidentiality. And yeah, that's all.
Cool. Yeah, thanks so much for that. And I kind of started it a minute and a half in, so we won't have to repeat an introduction. It'll just kind of dive right in.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Cool. All right, folks. We will see you in 45 minutes.
Okay.
Let's see.
Myself in anarchist activism and politics about 20 years ago. That makes me feel old when I say that, but it's about that now. It was like, the turn of the millennium. I was really into it and enthusiastic for a few years until I started to be a bit, I started to get frustrated with some of the contradictions and hypocrisies among some of my anarchist comrades, right, as we all do after a certain amount of time. The gloss wears off. In my case, the thing that frustrated me the most was actually like class elitism among the university student anarchists and stuff, and that's what my larger dissertation is about. This book is kind of a chapter 3 of my full PhD dissertation, which is about how middle-class anarchists fuck up intersectionality. And what I mostly focus on in this book and tonight are contradictions around like race and gender and anarchist politics. And I'll start with like an example that kind of shows how anarchists, fall short sometimes. I'll tell a story of how these activists in Montreal, this is about 2006-07 now, we organized a speaking tour of some indigenous activists from Oaxaca, Mexico to come up and do a tour about the struggles of their region. And as the events go on, there's two of them. There's a man and there's a woman. The man is talking about, union movements and political repression and political prisoners and state and speaking in and everyone loved it. They're like, yeah, he's talking about how his indigenous villages never voted in a political party. It's always rejected the politics of the state. Magdalena, when she spoke, when she went up, she talked about her work as going around speaking with women of the region, helping them become familiar with and resist and avoid the sterilization programs that the government tries to apply to indigenous women in that area. And when she spoke about the need to maintain harmonies among all of God's creation and stuff. And so, and people didn't respond to her very well. No one asked her questions after. As the events went on, she spoke less and less. By the end of the tour, she was just introducing Juan in some kind of ritualized reading in her indigenous language, like lending a touch of authenticity to the whole thing, and then Juan would talk and she would say goodbye, and it was really kind of upsetting to watch how that happened. And I wrote a paper about it, like my first published paper after that, being like, what is going on here? Anarchists say they want to take lead from the indigenous people in the global south till they actually start speaking, and then actually they should learn from the anarchists. And is it really that Magdalena needs to be politicized? Do the anarchists really have better knowledge than her? Or how do we build these kind of coalition, horizontal solidarity in this situation? And I talked about how that there was two public and private dichotomies that made it difficult for her listeners to understand her as political, right? It was the fact that she spoke in a religious language, and it was the fact that she talked about her work with women's reproductive health. It was both of those things might have worked against her a little bit, but both together really made it difficult for people to see how she was a political agent. And so, and I published that, and then I got feedback on it. Feedback was like, oh yes, it's true, we should try harder to respect indigenous identity. And I was like, this is not about indigenous, that is not about pretending, nodding and smiling politely and being nice to the person, but secretly thinking that they're wrong. That's not actually really very anti-racist, and you're just being polite. And so I thought I got to go show people that anarchism has its own cosmology. There's a whole bunch of theological and cosmological precepts that inform anarchist politics, and that's not a bad thing or whatever. It's just all politics has cosmological foundations, and to think that we have no cosmology but they have cosmology, or we're rational and they're not rational, and that whole rubric comes from the colonial encounter. And so I'm like, okay, in order to tell the story, I actually got to go back. I got to go back and show that how anarchism comes from history, how it's developed in a certain cultural moment. A lot of standard histories of anarchism will talk about peasant movements, Christian millenarian movements, all these things as precursors to anarchism. And then you've got, bam, modernity and anarchism. Well, what happened in between there and there? And so I go to the library, I'm reading about, the overlap between anarchist thinkers and practitioners of early socialist politics and the social spheres in which they moved and the things they're interested in, and find that, in order to talk about this, I need to talk about all these revolutionary fraternities. I need to talk about revolutionary brotherhoods, and I need to talk about these reading societies and these new masculine public spheres that are emerging in this modern European situation. And I need to talk about the Illuminati, and I need to talk about Freemasons, and I don't want to talk about that. Actually, that wasn't my fucking project at all. But around the same time, so something happened that made me think, oh no, I got to do this. And that was that I leave after one of our collective meetings one day. It was a Zapatista Solidarity Collective. This is also about 2007. It was the same collective that organized the speaking tour that I just mentioned. Afterwards, one of the guys says, oh, you know, we got to do better, right? We organize film screenings and fundraisers and all that, but you know, but the people in power, they're really organized. No, they're really organized, you know. And he's speaking in this way where I'm like, what is he talking about? Like, he seemed like he was talking about something more than the obvious fact that, you know, the governments have armies and we don't. And he's like, yeah, they're organized. And so that's what do you mean? And then him and a few others start talking about, oh, the banking system and the Federal Reserve and the Bilderberg Group and the Freemasons and the Knights Templar and the whole thing. And I was like, wow, like, I didn't really know the story when I heard it. It was kind of like, I heard bits and pieces. I heard some things about Freemasons, but I hadn't heard this historical narrative before. And I was kind of taken in by it, too. I was like, I don't know, maybe, like, I don't know. And then one of the guys says something about how all these guys in these secret, you know, powerful groups are Jewish. And I was like, oh, that rings a bell. That's not cool. This is where we're going with this. Okay, and I wasn't expecting it. We're like in an anti-racist Zapatista Solidarity Collective. I'm like, what the fuck? Okay. So we start engaging about it. We have a talk, you know. I say something like, you know, maybe there are secret ritual fraternities decorating the capitalist class, you know, but like, is it really reasonable to think that they're all of the same religion? Like, maybe they're all capitalists, right? Maybe they're all Christian and Jewish and whatever, all kinds of stuff. And the conversation doesn't end that evening, right? He recommends me some reading and tells me to watch some stuff on YouTube, which has just been born. This is like 2006, right? So, and I'm like, okay. And I go away and I read the book he recommends, which is The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and I watch the YouTube videos, and I watch all the YouTube videos, and we continue to talk about it over the course of the year, okay, like, and the punchline here is that the two guys that were into the idea of the Jewish conspiracy, through the dialoguing around it over the course of the year, actually moved away from that position. That was important, I thought, and I thought, because I was tuned in then to like what was going on, and I knew what was going on YouTube, and I was sort of like clued in to this cultural phenomenon of the conspiracy theories in the YouTube. I kept watching it, and I kept realizing more and more people were really into this, and I thought it's important to write something about it, maybe to hopefully try and disinform some of this history about the left and the secret societies, given how much hype there is about it. You know, maybe at a different moment, in a different collective, in a different year, you know, that guy saying that, you know, we might have just like thrown him out of the collect, but like, that's not what we did. We argued with him and we managed to change his mind, and I thought that was cool. So I wrote this book. Now, a lot of the people that need to read the book will probably not read the book, but that's why I want to make YouTube videos. But anyways, I'm working up to it. That's kind of the intro of how why I came to do the book and what the book aims to do. It kind of tries to do two things at once. It tries to, you know, my original point, right, was like, let's talk about what is the cosmology of anarchism, what is the gender of anarchism, how is anarchism a cultural product that developed at a certain moment in time and has baggage for those reasons, and talk about that in terms of how to do anti-colonial solidarity work with people who have religious inclinations, you know, including but not exclusively indigenous people, and then at the same time, you know, address some of these questions about conspiracy and secret societies that's really hyped in pop culture. I'm going to, at this point, maybe just go into some of the historical material. I'm going to, like, kind of, you know, go through a bit about what's in the book in terms of the 19th century. You know, in your standard history of social movements, anarchist history of social movements, they'll often start with things like Anabaptists, ranters, diggers, these sort of early spontaneous, millenarian, chiliastic social movements, peasant movements. And then at some point you have organized social movements with programs for change. So instead of like a spontaneous movement that like grows up surrounding a charismatic figure who whips everyone into a frenzy. You have organizations with membership and rules and plans and things, right? And these are including, and this is including Christian movements, like heretic movements, like just after the Crusade. And then what happened there? There's a lot of things that happened there. There's many factors. It's not that simple, but one thing that I talk about is how a lot of mystical treatises were rediscovered during the Renaissance, okay, that were not Christian at all. There was Kabbalah, there was Neoplatonic revival, Platonism, there was algebra, the Pythagorean theorem, all of these things were rediscovered. And the Hermetic doctrine was also rediscovered during this time, the Hermetica. Has anyone heard of the Hermetica? Who knows the Hermetica? Oh, okay, so, all right. Now, these were a series of texts that were written in the 1st or 2nd centuries AD, but during the Renaissance they were held to be much older. They were understood to be reporting the original ancient secret, original knowledge of ancient Egypt, which came before the Greeks, which informed the Greeks. So the translator that was working on Plato at the time, when the Hermetic text came in, they're like, fuck Plato, drop that guy, this is the real thing, not this. Everyone thought this was the real, true, unadulterated original knowledge. And the Hermetic doctrine has a variety of features which you'll actually recognize. Those of you that don't know the Hermetica, this will be familiar because it comes up in almost all New Age stuff, okay? In the Hermetic doctrine, the cosmic time is characterized by a pulsation of emanation and return, okay? Where the universe kind of unfolds from an original unity into like ever more complexity by splitting into twos and threes and so forth. And the idea is that there will also be like a regeneration of unity, that at some point there'll be like a oneness that is found again, and that humanity, or man, coming to, of course, man coming to consciousness of his role, in the regeneration of cosmic unity is an important step in the regeneration of this unity itself. Like, we have to help this come to pass. As the complexity unfolds, there's the idea of like correspondences and energy and light and secret correspondences that unify the levels for those that are aware of them. Man is a microcosm of the universe, and so we can learn about the universe from learning about ourselves. As above, so below. Although things seem different, there is an underlying unity, so in duration everything remains related, like all is one. You get the idea, right? And so in this worldview, God and creation become the same, and man becomes divine and has a defined role, and man is allowed to act on the universe. Instead of it being kind of sacrilegious, there's like a whole Christian idea of like that, you're not allowed to act on the world. But here you're entitled and empowered to act on the world. And not only that, but we've got some kind of, divine role in making the world a better place and creating kind of a secularized, heaven on earth in the here and now through building it, through agency, through knowledge. And so the Hermetica lends itself to a variety of projects, right? It's adaptable to a variety of things. The Hermetica arrives with a really neat metaphysical geometry, right? And it arrives at the same time as things like algebra and the Pythagorean theorem that actually allow people to build things in ways never before imagined. So vaulted cathedrals, calculus, mathematics is a very powerful form of magic. It arrives alongside this metaphysics that is also very mathematical, and the whole thing lends itself to a massive investment in mathematical forms and understanding, which becomes like the real basic truth and language of the universe, and develops science basically on this basis. And that is talked about quite a bit, like in in histories of the Enlightenment these days. That's kind of well known, thanks to Francis Yates. But what isn't talked about as much is how the Hermetica has helped inspire new leveling movements from below. Okay, specifically here, the key example being Freemasonry. Okay, Freemasons, they dress themselves up like Egyptians. It's all about Egypt. It's all about ancient knowledge. It's all about building the metaphor of building a new society, and importantly, the idea that man tends toward perfection, and it's a matter of like helping this along through like it's a mixture of like inbuilt cosmic fate and will and agency that's going to create this new perfect world that men themselves are going to build. So it's not like heaven on earth being graced by some kind of something falling from the sky. It's that we're going to build it. So it's a new kind of scientific Christian heaven on earth. Pantheism is a word that starts being used at this time. Pantheism being like God is inside us and all around us. The fact that we now are able or entitled to consider ourselves as divine agents means we can act. The Freemasons, they were anti-clerical, like critical of the church and the monarchy, but also like dressed up in Egyptian and Druidic thing and created rituals, and it was all about this sort of pantheistic spirituality. These are all masculine public spheres, right? Here we're getting back to the question of gender. This is kind of what social movements look like after the witch hunts, right? I mean, you have the women's status and participation in these other early modern social and Christian peasant movements that we talked about was always ambiguous. It's not like necessarily women were in charge, but women were there. In these places, women are not actually present. These discussions are happening in specifically masculine spheres. Where it's men that have access to the ancient original secret magic wisdom, and it's them that's going to illuminate the way. The Masons are both liberal and radical. Okay, yes, so some people involved, they are just using this fraternity as a way to consolidate their already existing social power, okay? Some people that were involved were actually looking to dismantle hierarchies in society in a more profound way. Both things were happening at once. There's a sign of tension between the discourse of Freemasonry, like meeting upon the level, building a new egalitarian society, but women aren't allowed in, Jews aren't allowed in, workers aren't allowed in, and then as things unfold, people bring these contradictions to light. What are we going to do about it? And little, things start happening. Okay, we'll reduce the literacy requirement, or we won't make people pay to be in anymore. They never let the women in, but they did start letting more workers in, and there was this. In any case, there was always this tension, right, between the people that were kind of like your bourgeois liberal revolutionaries, right, and people who were to become more socialist, radical revolutionaries, and one of the people who joined Masonic Lodge and was discontented or not satisfied with the level of critique that he found within was Adam Weishaupt, who was the founder of the Illuminati in 1776, founded this group. He was a professor from Bavaria. He started a group with like 5 students. It was like a reading society. They mostly just talked about things that are quite commonplace now, but were very provocative at the time, like the importance of science versus religion, and they did also talk about cosmic regeneration. Weishaupt's writings are like a mix of like the Pythagorean mystery schools and Eleusinian mysteries and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and it's all mixed together. And he's going to unearth this secret ancient magical wisdom and create a new egalitarian social society. It becomes quite big. It ends up including people like Mozart and Herder and Goethe and all these famous 19th century or 18th century guys. And there's like 3 levels. It's kind of modeled after the Masonic structure in the sense that there's levels and it's pyramid shaped and stuff. And at some point they do go back to the lodges to try and get more people involved, right? Like these days, you're trying to get more people involved in your radical social movement. You might go, where might you go, right? There, at the time, the place where you'd be most likely to find people who would listen to you and maybe join your crew would be in Masonic lodges. So they'd go there and they'd get more friends. At some point, one of the members is pissed off, probably for good reason, God knows why, whatever, how collectors are, and he goes and tells on his employer, and the Duchess of Bavaria ends up finding out and freaks out and feels like this group its purpose is to like annex
Bavaria to Prussia, and a whole repressive campaign begins, and the Illuminati are chased out. And this is the first time you actually hear the idea that all Freemasons are under the control of the Illuminati. But this was the government worried about the Freemasons being radicalized by the Illuminati. At this point, the members go into hiding or exile. At around the same time, the French Revolution is happening. After the French Revolution, all the monarchies in Europe, they're very freaked out, obviously. They don't want the same thing to happen. And you have the first Interpol kind of scenario. You have the first cooperation among different heads of state monarchs in Europe where they get together, the Congress of Vienna in 1814, and they decide to cooperate among themselves to prevent revolutionary inroads in Europe. So they're going to extradite prisoners and stop the dissemination of literature and across borders and stuff like that. And so at this time, anyone who had been part of the Illuminati or any other similar group goes into hiding. It's a period of repression. And you do see at this time other groups starting up that are kind of mimic the Illuminati or the Masons in structure and form. They're pyramid-shaped organizations that have ritual titles and stuff. And it's partly because it's practical, right? Okay, first of all, it's partly because they're descending from the same group, but it's not always that they're descending, one group a guy goes into hiding and starts up a new group somewhere else. Some of it's like that, but some of it's just that people are copying, This huge scare that the government created around this group had the effect of being inspiring people to try it maybe a little bit, right? They created a whole aura of fear around this and the danger and the possible dangers of these secret societies, and so people were like, well, let's start some. Let's do this then, and so it was partly practical, right? The way that people organized in this way, if you don't know everyone else in the organization, then if you get caught and tortured, you can't give up your comrades, right? Has anyone seen the movie The Battle of Algiers?
We're actually screening it in 3 weeks if you haven't seen it. So
watch it. It's a good movie. Yeah, it's not. They're not pyramid shaped, but there's a cell structure in the revolutionary in Algeria where not everyone knows who everyone else involved. Anyway, it's a practical tactic. So partly people are organizing these pyramid shaped groups because it's practical. Partly they're doing it though because there's a symbolic strength to it. The idea, the self-understanding of the people involved, connecting themselves in their own eyes and understanding and in the eyes of others with a long lineage of secret, important, magical knowledge that's going to help them succeed, makes the people feel filled with a sense of right and importance and lends power to what they're doing. So both things are happening. Yeah, so Bakunin was someone, moving forward, who also talked about how revolution was, imminent in the people, but illuminated men were necessary to guide them in the right direction. Speaking of himself, of course, right? And Bakunin's, he was also a Freemason. He also tried the tactic of getting comrades that way. It's very similar to what Weishaupt was doing, except that Bakunin was wanting to infiltrate the IWA to wrest it from authoritarian socialist control, whereas Weishaupt was looking to infiltrate Masonic lodges to wrest them from liberals' control. So in a way what they were doing was very different, but in a way their tactic was actually a bit similar. And they're working in a tradition. The International Working Men's Association was founded, the founding meeting was in the Freemasons' Tavern. There was exiled Republican Socialist Freemasons. If it wasn't for the support of the Freemasons, the IWA would not necessarily have gained the strength that it did at the time. And the circle A and the star and a lot of these symbols that we associate with socialism and anarchism date back to this period. The star hosts an endless charge of meanings going back to Pythagorean times. It was used by the second grade of Masons to it was used by the Masons to symbolize the second grade of membership of comrade or compañero. And then it was adopted by the IWA and socialists at that time from the second grade of the Freemasons. The circle A, I should put a thingy in the book here to show you. The early versions of the circle A are clearly made with the set square and plumb line of Masonic iconography. I'll pass it around. Okay? Don't hold it. That's the Spanish locale of the IWA. You know, and anarchists these days, we don't necessarily know this history, and it's not that we have to. But it is interesting. We don't know this history necessarily. Like May Day, you know, we often think that like May Day marches go back to like the massacre in Haymarket. You know, but why was there a march in Haymarket on May Day in the first place? May Day was already an important day. You know, the Illuminati was founded on May Day. Like, May Day was a very important day for hundreds of years, and we don't know this. But at the time in the 19th century, a lot of these associations were actually well known to the people involved, and they lent power to what people were doing. They contextualized things in history in a way that like made things meaningful and sensible to the people involved. And the main people that were really unhappy with the kind of overlap of pantheistic spirituality and ritualism and so forth and socialist politics were Marx and Engels, who were into their very scientific socialism. But even Marx's theory of history, it doesn't actually depart that much from the whole New Age imagination. An era of communism will come about that will be perfect, you know, after a mixture of inbuilt cosmic fate and agency and will. And there's a whole chapter in the book about Hegel and the dialectic and how Hegel was a Hermetic theorist and stuff, but I'll leave that for the Hegel nerds and people that really want to learn about Marx and Hegel and the Hermetica and all that. But it's there if you want it. So the point is, whether Marx liked it or not, right? The people that first translated like the Communist Manifesto was the American Association of Spiritualists. Not first translated it in America, I should say. But it probably really pissed off Marx. But that's how it was, right? And I think I'm gonna give some more examples. Just gonna whip through some other quick examples which are dealt with, you know, in more detail in the book of New Age connections with 19th century socialism and anarchism. You've got like Charles Fourier, you know, who's often mentioned in histories of anarchism. He had this idea of a law of passional attraction, which suggested that there was a series of correspondences and balances in nature that could be discerned and then applied to human society, which is clearly a kind of hermetically influenced worldview. There was a lot of anarchists that were into the theosophy of Elena Pavlova Blavatsky, who had a whole anyone know Blavatsky?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. She had a whole worldview that was wild, but it involved things like, you know, cosmic root races, finding cosmic union, and had a lot. And I talk in the book about Darwinian theories of evolution, Blavatsky, theosophical ideas of evolution and revolution, how those ideas developed in tandem. Talk about Tolstoy, who admired Fedorov, who thought that the task of humanity was to resurrect the forefathers from like cosmic dust in the atmosphere, and Rhoda Kanati, who was the first proselytizer of anarchism in Mexico, who like distributed pamphlets called Neopanteísmo, and was Sandino, who was a revolutionary in early 20th century in Nicaragua, who the later Sandinistas in the 70s and 80s were named after. He was really into theosophy and Zoroastrianism and Hinduism, and flew like a 7-striped rainbow flag full of like, you know, different religious symbols, and was kicked out of the Third International as a consequence because Stalin was really not into that. We don't necessarily know that about him, but you know, there's all these stories. You know, and all these complex scenarios of, you know, colonial encounter, they really deserve more detail than I'm giving them now, and even than I give them in the book. But I whip through these examples to give an idea, suggesting that, you know, the sort of cosmological fusion and syncretism that always underlied and informed anarchist politics from the beginning just keeps going, and maybe just finds its latest expression in present-day anarchists' kind of selective fascination with indigenous cosmologies and cultures, for better or for worse, right? And I'm going to stop with the history there. That's like just whipping through the history. The idea is just that, the basic point, right, is just that socialism and anarchism, and, you know, we can distinguish those, you know, later if we like, obviously, but and occultism and New Age spirituality kind of developed and coexisted in a complementary fashion through a lot of the 19th century, and that this is downplayed or rewritten in mainstream histories of the left. Just as like Newton's dabbling in alchemy and magic is sort of tends to be downplayed in histories of the Enlightenment. So you have like Charles Fourier's law of passional attraction rewritten as a society in which people are allowed to engage in free play of passions. I invited Peter Marshall, but he's not here, is he? Because that was him. Anyway. Yeah, the connection with fascism is highlighted. Like, if ever you talk about occultism and the New Age, what we hear about is like how fascists are doing it, and that is absolutely true. The fascists picked up all this stuff and were inspired by it. But so it's not that occult spirituality, the occult revival, New Age spirituality, or all this necessarily leads to a kind of radical revolutionary politics. It doesn't necessarily lead there at all. Magic, it can go in either direction. When approached with people with a lust for power, magic can be used to justify and advance those aspirations. But if it was not, for the influx of so much knowledge charged as ancient magical wisdom at the time that helped triangulate popular religion, modern materialism, and social discontent in new ways, we might not have seen anarchism and socialism as we know them. So then the takeaway here, and coming back to the present day, and there's 2 chapters at the end that kind of bring us back to the present and then kind of reflect on why is this relevant to think about now. And I'll just whip through that quickly. I don't want to tell you everything because I want you to buy the book, but give you some idea, So one of the points is, returning to the idea of atheism and how that complicates questions of anti-colonial solidarity with all these diverse movements in the world that we hope to work together with, and how the question is not just one of respecting identity. I talk about how the question of spirituality, religion, in terms of the debates around cultural appropriation, which is a big important topic these days in social movements. And it makes sense that, for example, people are critical of cultural appropriation right now because in this particular historical moment, it's possible for people with dominant identities and status to valorize themselves and authenticate themselves by donning accoutrements of people that they structurally oppress, and so it makes sense to talk about that and why that is and how it's fucked up. But we also lose something when we reduce culture to property, especially religion or a question of spirituality, because what we're doing when we say that cosmology is only are appropriate to specific preordained identities, we're basically saying they're false, because we're saying they're not applying across the cosmos whatsoever, and they only apply to certain people. And so we kind of reduce all non-Western cosmology to cultural accoutrements in a marketplace as big as the universe. And that's kind of fucked up and colonial and racist too. So how do you navigate that? I don't have the answer, but it's an important dilemma to think about, in terms of gender, we can say anarchism, it's perfectly fine for anarchists today to aspire to be against all forms of domination. I think that's good. I think we should do that. But just saying it doesn't necessarily make it so. We have to work at that, because the revolutionary person, what we imagine the revolutionary person to be, sound like, do, is constructed against a variety of exclusions at the outset. Being recognized, socially recognized as an anarchist is not just about, it's often about demonstrating a certain amount of cultural capital, it tends to be a bunch of masculine cultural capital, knowing what Malatesta said on a certain day, or what Kropotkin wrote, or and subscribing to a certain kind of analysis and model of power, wherein men's oppression by the state becomes a prototype for all power. Which, anarchism is a cultural product. It's invented by certain people at a certain time, so it's got baggage, It doesn't mean that it can't be, it doesn't mean that we throw it out, but it means we have to think carefully about what we mean, and how to make it true that anarchism would be really against all forms of domination and not always be coming from the vantage point of the man concerned about the state. and it is. I don't want to force an analogy by being like it's a boys' club. It's like the same as like these initiatic societies of the 19th century. Like I don't know, pushing my luck here, but there are some hidden correspondences that are worth thinking about. The idea of the vanguard. There's this whole thing, anarchists. We're not vanguardists. Marxists, they're vanguardists. We're not vanguardists. Okay, unless you think of the vanguard as a political party. Then I don't see how anarchists aren't vanguardists. Like anarchists, we've always imagined ourselves as, to have particular insight that we're looking to share with people, to move things along, and to change the world. And that's not a bad thing. But these days it tends to be dissimulated in a lot of discourses of solidarity. Like I'm just taking lead from these guys who are more oppressed than me, and that's the only reason I'm doing what I'm doing. But it's a bit disingenuous. We don't talk about consciousness raising because it sounds too Marxist, but there's like all these people having anti-oppression workshops and other things which are basically consciousness raising activities, which are fine, but just I think it's important to own what we're doing sometimes. Anarchism does have a project. There's a whole discussion about sovereignty and gender in there, which is a bit detailed and technical. I won't get into the whole thing, but staying with gender, like I complain about Agamben anyway. I swear to God, no. Like, he proceeds as if you can like equate human being and like male citizen of Rome or France, It's like, and if you follow indigenous women's writing and words on sovereignty, you learn something that you fail to notice if you read people like Agamben and Schmidt and so forth, which is that women and children were never like subsumed by the sovereign. It's male citizens that are subsumed by the sovereign, because women and children are subsumed by the male head of household, who is then subsumed by the sovereign. And this is important because that whole displacement in sovereignty is carried forward and replicated in the anarchist idea of autonomy. The autonomy is sovereignty of the person. It's like the idea of autonomy only makes sense and it happens in dialectic with the idea of sovereignty. It's kind of like taking a state discourse and applying it to the person. So it's trying to be against the state, but actually it's replicating the state's logic. And just as the state considers itself benevolent to those, that it subsumes, could not live without, its citizens, so does, the anarchist sort of feel himself benevolent to the women and children that he subsumes and cannot live without, who clean up all his shit or whatever, right? There's a bit of a parallel there that's good to think about. Okay, I'm going to just close now. I'm going to say a few things about secret societies and the whole thing about conspiracy theory before I finish. Okay, so anyone who's watched YouTube knows that the Illuminati are understood to be a truly extraordinary organization that has achieved the goals of its historical rival, right? The Holy Alliance that was begun in the 1814, which was actually the international cooperation of kings to try and consolidate like global power. So how the fuck did that happen? How did that story get turned around? And what's that about? There's multiple answers there. There's like a lot of things that happened. Why was that story turned around? Okay, it's partly because from the very beginning at the French Revolution, there was a whole propaganda thing about the Freemasons being under the control of the Illuminati, right? Although at that point it was the government saying it, not the people about the government. So it kind of starts there. But then you have at the beginning of the 20th century, you have a whole anti-Semitic propaganda campaign that kind of links the Jews with the Freemasons, and then that kind of, it's a way of like criminalizing the Jews, and so that takes on a whole life of its own. And then you have right now, at this particular moment, you've got a revival of these ideas that proliferate at like amazing speeds. And you could say, oh, it's because of the technology, it's because of the internet, it's because of YouTube, or because of the algorithm on YouTube. But maybe that's partly true. It partly has to do with the way information comes on the internet. But maybe it's also has to do, who's putting these videos on the internet? What's going on? And here I'm going to sound a bit like a conspiracy theorist myself, maybe. But when I watched these first YouTube videos in 2006, when I first went down the rabbit hole, I noticed, I saw what there was. And then I see that in 10 years later, they are different, they're something happened. Like the first ones, like all the 9/11 documentaries, they were largely, there's outliers, but a lot of them, mostly they were about oil men and governments fucking over the little people. Now it's about a globalist conspiracy against America. And I don't know, is that just because people are stupid and they make stupid things, and there's these stupid guys who are conspiracy theorists who aren't educated and they sit in their mother's basements, and like this whole stereotype of who's a conspiracy theorist and how they're white working class idiots who like don't understand things and are ruining the world. And I'm like, well, the first conspiracy theorist I met was like a Mexican Zapatista solidarity activist guy, so it doesn't really work for me. And I think it's important to think about, like, rather than just writing it off, especially since at this point writing it off, like, it doesn't, maybe 10 years ago you could be like, oh, I'll just ignore those conspiracy theorists. But like right now, there's like, for every anarchist, there's like, 1 million people that thinks the world's run by the Illuminati. So I feel like it's important to figure out how to engage with this fucking problem somehow. My book is just one, it's not, I'm going to do it, right? It's one book. I'd like to think I can do it, but it's not going to do it. So how are we going to engage these things? And one of the things I feel like we can and should do, just in a general way, to engage this is to sort of, rather than call people stupid or engage them as the enemy, throw them out of the collective, we kind of honor the fact that there is some valid social commentary in these theories. Like they're getting at something. There's a reason why they're interesting to people. They're not all wrong. So like I have a quote here. I don't want to read this. Yeah. Some of my readers may already be aware. A significant fraction of the videos currently found on YouTube that critics commonly discuss as conspiracy theory tell stories of the Knights Templar finding secret treasure under Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem during the Crusades, with Illuminati-controlled Freemasons later using it to collapse the great world traditions into one big banking tradition in the name of Lucifer. Okay, so the scholarly, social scientists are always going to prefer things like systemic forces to like the whimsy of a few powerful knights and Freemasons, not to mention the Rothschilds, and that's fine. But it shouldn't take too much to notice that like this narrative and like the one by Karl Polanyi in The Great Transformation, like they're more different in form than in content, and as such it should be possible to go to someone who thinks this about the world and maybe bring them over to a kind of anti-capitalist politics as opposed to a fascist one, and so I think that's important to do. And even the lizards thing kind of makes sense, you could grant, in the sense that there's a long cultural tradition of referring to the blue-blooded aristocracy. Right? These things are allegorical in a way. And if you see them, maybe it's because I'm an anthropologist, but if you see these things as allegories, it's possible to like, get past your initial like, what the fuck, and be like, oh, okay, these people are upset about the world. They think the world is so fucked up that it's literally run by evil and the devil. That's someone who really hates banks. Maybe we could work with this, I think I'm going to end there, except that I want to say one thing about the art of memory, which is something that's a whole thread running through the book, which I'll just say something brief about. There's a classical art of memory, which... the classical art of memory, I won't explain the whole thing now, but it was taken up by Renaissance magicians, okay? It's an art of like how to make people remember things, how to impress things upon the memory, and how to, and this whole bunch of knowledge was also then taken up by Freud, right, in his theory of psychoanalysis, which is informed by Renaissance magician theories of memory. And then Freud's theories of psychoanalysis are like taken up by like advertising PR guys, Edward Bernays, his son-in-law, and the whole story there. And so in some ways, like Renaissance magic is being used to mind control us, just not in the way that conspiracy theorists might otherwise suggest, right? Both conspiracy theorists, like amateur documentary makers on YouTube, and like CNN and mainstream media guys are using these techniques to affect our minds, like when they're showing us these images. And it would be good to learn about how this works and what this history is, and just get a handle on what's going on, because now as then the Hermetica like proves adaptable to a variety of projects, whether it's pyramid schemes or leveling schemes or pyramid schemes for leveling, as above so below. That's all I did there.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks, Erica. Thanks, past Erica, for that presentation.
We meet in an hour of change and challenge.
I'll stop that. All right, well, cool. We've got some time now to answer some questions. I wonder, Erica, did you have anything you wanted to add on, or reflecting on that presentation? Anything else you wanted to mention before diving into Q&A?
Only that I did listen to it. I don't always listen to it the whole time, but I did listen to it today. And it is interesting to hear. It's only been a year or so, but the year we've been through with COVID and all of the hoopla around conspiracies around that already makes some of the things I say seem a bit dated, which is fine. It's interesting now. So I've been reflecting on that. But no, I'm not going to talk too much now. I want to hear what people ask, and I'll speak based on what people ask.
Cool. Yeah. So if folks have questions, I see one just got submitted. There's that Q&A function. You can just submit them there, and we will get to them as we go along here. So there was a question submitted by Ramona. This one is, Erica, you described the Hermetic worldview as a very masculine one, where man sort of has dominion over the earth. Do you have an alternate cosmology you have come across or could suggest for anarchism that may be more collectivist in nature?
Well, the Hermetic worldview doesn't necessarily need to be inherently masculinist. I'll start by saying that it was the case that it was groups of men who picked up this idea and worked on it and transformed it and developed it in certain ways. So in that sense, it was men that worked with the idea, and then the cultural products they create are androcentric. This doesn't mean that so the idea of improving the world and building institutions, or let's not say institutions if we're being very anarchist about it, but building social formations and social relations that are better than the ones before, doesn't need to be considered inherently masculine. But it is true that the tradition as it exists, it's what the secret knowledge is imagined to be, is biased towards the kinds of knowledge that, men, activists, and scholars like share and value among each other, and such that the secret, the secret knowledge itself is sort of, insofar as we honor an anarchist tradition and give someone and consider that they have authority to speak and give special insight based on the fact that they have access to what's considered a specifically anarchist, capital A tradition, and that they are given precedence, then we are continuing that tradition. Like every time I try to publish something that's critical about anarchist history and I'm told it's great, except you have to cite more X old anarchist guy, I'm like, you're not getting the point. But is there an alternative one that is outside of that? I don't know. I'm not sure if there's a set of ideas that's recognizably within or adjacent to the left that we could consider as being very separate from this history that that I've described. There are, insofar as you're locating it in that social movement history, there are one way to answer it though is that there are many different non-Western traditions of resistance and indigenous traditions of resistance and cosmological premises for resistance to capitalism and all sorts of forms of domination that do exist in the world today, that are not coming from this white European male social history and set of constructs, right? And in a way, maybe that's the best, and that's my better answer maybe, is that there are all kinds of traditions that are not specifically partaking of Hermetic, visions. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was to try and argue and explain to anarchists that, do think it's important to know what Kropotkin and Malatesta had, and give a lot of value to that, to explain that, how, if you're going to succeed in challenging a lot of the neoliberal capitalist extraction projects and all the various things that are going on that are so terrible, it would be good to know how to interact with and collaborate with social movements in the global south and all over the world that do not necessarily articulate their projects in the language and discourse and framework of the specific European modern left with all of its cultural baggage, and that it's important to do so in a way that's actually engaging or with these other collaborators on sort of equal footing, rather than sort of the things we all see so often, which is we need representation by minorities, or stacking, sort of being polite to and including including difference, in our panel or whatever it is, collective film group, without really engaging with and being changed by that cultural difference. Yeah, and it's, yeah, so there are all kinds of examples of different worldviews and visions, but they're not, some of them are so different that it's hard for us to recognize them and engage with them. Some of them, we don't even recognize them as the left, because we are biased and we have certain ideas about what an anti-capitalist, leftist, anti-racist, anti-sexist, trans friendly, everything movement should look like. And then we're looking for something that we're already familiar with. And yeah, sometimes these things can be, look different, look and sound different, and they often look and sound, they're going to look and sound religious or spiritual sometimes. The premises and the references they use are not going to be Malatesta and Kropotkin. It's going to be something else, and it's going to be something that might be non-secular or non-Western, and maybe hard to recognize as important or rational at first, but actually is very important to consider and think about. That would be my long, rather.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, and there's another question that is perhaps related, but connects to the conspiratorial threads. So this is from Clint. They ask, do you see in your research that differing branches of anarchism pull from different conspiratorial threads, or is the cosmology more unified across politically disparate groups?
I'm not sure I fully understand. Is Clint there to ask? Can we ask Clint a little bit more about that? I would say that the general answer would be to say that if I think all anarchists are the same, then obviously not. Certainly anarchism is a word that's used in many different ways by many different people in many different languages and by many different generations around the world, right? And some of them, but I don't know what we mean about pulling from conspiratorial threads. I want to know what that means.
Clint clarified and just asked perhaps more directly, do different anarchist groups have different cosmological values?
I would say that a lot of anarchist groups, by virtue of insofar as anarchist groups share something as anarchist groups, because, as an anthropologist, here, I'll back up. Okay. As an anthropologist, you have to look at anarchism as a cultural product. So anarchism and how it's manifested, what its values are, what the practices are associated with it, they will change from place to place. In that being said, there are certain things that seem to be, that are relatively consistent among those who self-identify as anarchists around the world. And in my larger ethnography that I'm working on now, Good Politics, it's a multi-sided study of various anarchist collectives and how they collaborate. And in different times you highlight, like, how anarchist collectives work, their internal organization, how they do meetings, what's acceptable as meeting behavior, and what does consensus consist of. And then it is, similar and different in places like Mexico City or Montreal, and you can apply that to anywhere. And so in some ways, anarchists are different everywhere. And, it's an anecdote, but one of the examples I used talking about the question of religion and spirituality again, because that's continuous with the talk today. In Mexico, there was one time we were coming back from a big summit, like protesting the COP 15, 16, I don't remember, the climate summit, okay, and the UN climate summit in Cancun. And we're taking a big caravan back to Mexico City, and it's right around December 12th, which is the day of the Virgen de Guadalupe, very important holiday in Mexico. And there are people doing a pilgrimage to the cathedral to honor the Virgen. And the anarchists from the bus are like, oh yeah, the Virgen, that's a Christian thing. Yeah, we're not down with that. Of course, the church is terrible. We don't like that. But that Virgen de Guadalupe is actually just, was originally this indigenous goddess that lived on that, mountain, and then was associated with the spot on the top of this mountain that then the Catholics then built a church, on top of. But, so they basically blah, blah, blah. They reclaimed the Virgen de Guadalupe as a sort of indigenous goddess so that then they can sort of identify with her and then participate in this pilgrimage. And there's, there's this, and go seamlessly from like this caravan protesting the summit in Cancun to this religious pilgrimage to honor this deity. And this is something that, you probably need at least 10 or 15 minutes more explanation to really understand what I'm talking about fully. But the point is that if it's not sort of clear what I'm talking about, it's because this sort of thing doesn't necessarily happen in Montreal, Quebec, or New York, or whatever. It's not familiar, like that anarchists would come back from an anti-capitalist summit and then go march together to a church along with a lot of pious, people involved in a form of popular Catholicism. And so anarchism, does anarchism have different different kinds of anarchists have different kind of cosmological values? In some ways, you could say yes, in the sense that anarchism is culturally specific at different places, and the way it interacts with local forms of religion and general moral values it'll always be sort of syncretic in that sense. But insofar as there is something consistently recognizable as anarchism, insofar as there is a transnational anarchist culture that's sufficiently consistent such that anarchists from Barcelona, Greece, Mexico, Argentina, Montreal can get together at a summit and generally understand that they have certain things in common. They're going to have a general idea about, how to do a meeting. They're probably going to have an assembly. They're not going to immediately default to a majority vote. They're going to want to do something more consensus based. They're going to want to do forms of direct action. The phrase direct action will be familiar in various different places. Insofar as there is a shared transnational anarchist culture, and insofar as that anarchist culture does believe that people, we won't say men, but if we want to, let's say people have the possibility and responsibility and capacity to make human society better and make the world better, and that's our job, and that we have the power and the responsibility to do it, in some ways suggests a certain set of shared cosmological values that go back to, just deep, metaphysical questions like, are humans good, or do we have the capacity for good, and what is our role? Maybe we take it for granted that we can act on the world, right? Maybe what I'm saying is sort of not entirely obvious. It's what is so special about that idea that like we have the capacity to act on the world and the responsibility to do it? Like, but if you think about it, like that was not always the case in any given time or place throughout history. It wasn't always the case. It certainly wasn't the case in like in the Middle Ages in Europe, where there were the Christian culture that existed at the time. The idea that you could or would purport to act or change or act on the world yourself was completely unacceptable. Like, God created the world and you're supposed to just sort of take what you get and live in it. And any kind of idea that you would change it, was actually entirely sacrilegious, as well as, discouraged for authoritarian reasons. And it actually took this sort of whole cultural shift that happened over the course of the Renaissance and the early modern period, which I talk about in the book and whip through quickly in the talk, to normalize the idea that like humans working in collectivity can and should change the societies in which they live in, and that we have a possibility of actually succeeding in creating great things. And insofar as that, is related to the notion of us having and working with divine power, even if we don't no longer call it that, that's a shared cosmological value. Yeah, I'm good at these big, long, convoluted answers. Okay, try another one. Let's see.
Yeah, no, I love it. There's lots of threads to pull on in the book, and the first couple questions I think have been engaging with the these ideas around cosmology and how that relates to anarchism. And then there is this other thread that is related around conspiracy theories. So an anonymous attendee asked, how would you advise leftists or anarchists engage in conversations with people who believe in false conspiracy theories, but who are also grasping towards something real, like hierarchy or power or domination? And this person is thinking specifically about a family member who is very, in this moment, vaccine skeptic, and certainly does not fit any kind of basement dwelling stereotype.
Yeah, I feel you. I mean, I have people that I have affection for in my life who are also gravitated towards all kinds of conspiracy theories at various moments. And part of the reason I wrote the book is because, the story I tell in the book is about the Zapatista collective. That's a sort of ethnographic entry, but there are other stories, other people for which I have compassion that are amenable to all kinds of ideas that I disagree with. And, maybe I don't need to convince the anonymous attendee of this. Yeah, they're already sort of, agreeing that it's important to try to talk to someone. But I mean, I'll just start and I'll get to like how and what my advice would be about that in a moment. But I'll start by saying that just that I agree, and that I agree that like, people that are upset about how the world is, they're having a bad experience, right? Because it's just understandable, because the world is quite bad. I mean, unless you're a very powerful, privileged person, you're continually knocking against things and having experiences that suggest that things are stacked against you, that something's terribly wrong, that things are not fair the way they were supposed to be, or that you were told when you were a child, and you're doing everything right, and you're not getting any return, and you're still broke, and you're getting being treated terribly, and you can see that there's definitely a lot of lies going on television and the news. And then, so what do? You look it up on the internet. You look for knowledge. This is where people are going to go for knowledge these days. And to suggest that they shouldn't be doing this, or they're somehow silly for doing so, is obviously a very elitist position. Like academics will often look down their noses, and say, oh, people getting their information from YouTube, or people that are very dismissive of conspiracy theorists will just say, oh, they're just so silly. Why do we even pay attention to this sort of thing? Is sort of really missing the point, that, or is in poor faith, because the amount of people that are like, the same people that look down their noses and think, oh, this is all just, silly, and these people must be stupid, and what's wrong with them? they're working to publish books in language that is very hard to understand, or in academic journals that you can't even have access to. And a lot of the, superior theories of history and social analyses that, we wish conspiracy theorists would have are not available, and they're not made available to people. The sort of the structural analysis of power that we wish people had, instead of this sort of voluntarist theory of history where it's just a few bad guys that have gotten together. And, if we want people to adopt these structural analyses, they're not actually that easily accessible. So it's important to not blame people for doing the best they can for trying to figure out what's wrong with the world, and then ending up, on YouTube, on the internet, getting all kinds of information from wherever they get it. Now, what do you do when this has happened, and how do you speak to that person? I mean, this general advice I have, which I don't know if it's helpful, is with compassion, and by listening to what it is that they're saying, and for looking for the things that are amenable to and do overlap with what your theory of power and capitalism and global hierarchy looks like, and then cultivating and pointing out like how your similarities, and then moving forward from there. So like, and this is the kind of thing, like it kind of depends, it'll always depend on who you're speaking to. And so, but, and if it's a family member, if it's someone that you speak with like closely, like then it's someone that you have a relationship with. The thing is, it's always going to work better when it's someone you can have an ongoing conversation with, who you can, when you're talking to them, you can, honor the things that you're saying that are similar, and try and just move the discussion a little bit. The way I did with the guy in the collective, it was like, okay, look, I'm not going to say, just the moment you talk about Freemasons, I'm unfriending you. No, but granting a certain amount of ground, like, because we don't know, granting a certain amount of ground, so it makes it seem, and not just, but it really is, that you are respecting your interlocutor. You're respecting the person you have a conversation with. You're not just going to dismiss everything they say out of hand and treat everything they say like garbage, because no one wants to talk to you if you treat them like that. I mean, it just doesn't work. So you grant a certain amount of ground that you feel you can grant without betraying your most important values. In my case, it was like, maybe people do get together and like have weird rituals where they dress up in weird outfits and like think they're being like, whatever, get off on doing this. Like, and it is possible people do this. I don't know. And I'm not going to say that I know for sure it's not happening. So I'll grant that ground in our conversation, in an everyday kind of conversation way. And then, once we're having a rapport because we're agreeing about some things, then when I come in and say, but like, what, you think they're all Jewish though? Like, where does that even come from? Like, what is that? Then I'm being listened to. It's more likely that my friend or relative is going to listen to me because I am a respectful person to them in general, and I respect what they're saying, and I'm listening to them, and I'm not just calling them stupid. So that's just a rhetorical strategy. And it's always going to work better when you're actually having a conversation with someone, either in real life or on the phone or a video. I mean, just on comment threads, and I don't think many people are going to convince, anti-vaxxers of anything on a Facebook thread or Twitter. Or it's not that you shouldn't try. If you really need to have those arguments because it's happening and it's real, then you do what you need to do. But that would be the last thing I'd say about that, would just be that there's a lot of energy these days, we all see it, gets poured into arguing online about this stuff and many other things as well. And I don't know if that energy is always very well spent, right? And maybe that's something we all kind of agree with in general, but certainly around this topic, we got to be careful about, how much are we, and this comes up in the book that I'm writing now, the Good Politics book, the whole thing, but how much are we performing, good politics? How much are we performing the good political self for others when we are writing some of the things we're writing as leftists? And how much are we really trying to engage with and dialogue with the people that we're supposedly talking to? Like, would you be having the same conversation with this person you're arguing with online if it was a direct message and no one could see you writing it? Like, are you writing to the person you're writing to, or are you writing for everyone watching? And whenever we're writing online, we want to ask ourselves that question, and in general try to, just whenever it's important, to talk about it in real life and to talk to the person rather than for everyone watching. I don't know.
Yeah, and Erica, I know, like, one of, again, the a thread throughout the book that gets revisited is the relationship of conspiracy theory and social class. So I was wondering, because it is such like a big portion of the book, if you could say a little bit more about that and how thinking through those kinds of questions would be helpful within left social movements.
In the last chapter of the book, I do invite people to consider the relationship of social class and the category of conspiracy theory, not specifically or necessarily because it is more working class people that promote conspiracy theories, but because there's a class pattern in who says who believes in conspiracy theories, right? So there's a tendency for this category to be applied by professional middle class people to people who are less educated than they. And you can see that this year with COVID too. There's a stereotype of the COVIDiot anti-masker person is probably a white working class angry person. Interestingly, actually, with the QAnon, and QAnon happens like since I wrote the book. Otherwise, I would have, definitely had something. We'll get to that. But with QAnon, the stereotype is a bit different. I've noticed it's sort of like the stupid suburban housewife is the enemy as much as the like angry working class man. But in any case, it's interesting to notice the stereotypes that we associate with conspiracy theorists, and like and just that the phrase is used often by professional middle class people to discount the rationality of others less educated than they. And so I invite people to consider how, the phrase is used in the management of class respectability. Now, that being said, it's true that it is true, like when social psychologists notice that, people that seem to agree with conspiracy theories tend to be marginalized people. Like, they're not all wrong. I mean, in a way, it's kind of obvious. I mean, it's going to be marginalized people in general that want to theorize and talk about power in society in general, because they're the ones who are suffering the power. So big surprise that it's going to be people who suffer the brunt of this power that are going to be the ones theorizing it in conspiratorial ways or not, right? And among these marginalized people, you're going to have people in the working class, and maybe different thread. Maybe there's some good reason. Maybe there are understandable reasons why people in the working class might be gravitating towards some of these theories, which on the outset might look like don't make sense. We don't understand why people would be attracted to them except for being stupid racist people or something like that. I spoke a little bit about that at the end of the talk, about the allegories and stuff, but I would add to that, I guess, by being like, one of the things that's really one of the things that's really frustrating to people about conspiracy theory, and one of the reasons, the way we characterize it and define it, and then and notice that it's wrong, is insofar as the theory sort of suggests a really streamlined, pointy pyramid of power controlling the whole world. So there's this very there's like 5 guys at the top or something, and then it all filters down, and it all seems so fluid and perfect. I mean, there's no way it could possibly be like that, and it just seems far-fetched. And I agree that model of power in the world is a bit far-fetched. But it is also true that there are a lot of little pyramids. I mean, there are little conspiracies. Like there are conspiracies insofar as you do have, you know, powerful politicians, men, white men, usually rich guys, getting together behind closed doors, making decisions about things, trade, policy, borders, you know, COVID, whatever. That is not in the interest of the ordinary person. That's a conspiracy, I mean, right? And those happen all the time, little medium-sized ones, you know, and not one only, there's a whole bunch. And maybe, you know, like social scientists or just ordinary people in the professional middle class, like if they were willing to address the fact of like those pyramids, like that there are people in power and they are willing to, you know, do fight to stay there, and maybe it would be useful to acknowledge that, like useful to acknowledge that the power and privilege and that, you know, a typical bourgeois academic has in the world, like, is much greater than that of the janitor in the same school, and that, you know, who is right to feel that, you know, things are stacked against him or her or them. And so, like, it's interesting that this isn't talked about more, or it's interesting that I feel like it's interesting that social scientists don't really, in a way, it's very unsurprising, but in a way, it's still disappointing that social scientists don't actually want to talk about that much. And I'm going to talk, I mean, I talk in the little book about I'm going to get into the theory a little bit for those like that, just skimming it. So like, you know, in the academy for the whole all decades of my life as an academic, you know, Foucault has been like a hugely important reference, right? So Foucault and Foucault's model of power is sort of dispersed. It's dispersed in language, it's dispersed in the institutions. People who have, you know, positions in these institutions are sort of constrained by the power in the institution. They're constrained by disciplinary regimes. They're sort of, you know, if we didn't hire that greatly qualified Black woman to teach in the department, you know, it's not, I didn't do that, you know, the institution did that, you know, like I'm tied in by all the things that sort of control me in my professional life. And it's quite convenient a little bit, especially when you look at it and think at the same time in the academy, in the same decades, or, you know, there's this push to recognize agency among like all the oppressed people in the world. You know, oh, they might be oppressed, but they never suggest that, you know, the oppressed person doesn't also have agency, right? And I agree, and I don't disagree. We all always have some amount of agency, but it's interesting, I think, that in social theory, at least in the whole time I've been studying and academic, that we're encouraged to see the amount of power and agency that the oppressed person has, and at least they can, you know, they might be oppressed, but they can construct identities, and they can, you know, affirm those identities, and maybe they can purchase commodities to affirm those identities even more, and they can, and we're encouraged to see like all of the creative space and agency that the oppressed person really does have, while at the same time not really highlighting the specific agency, existential and otherwise, of, you know, the person, the relatively privileged academic, the person who's creating this knowledge and theory in the first place. And like, you know, what I'm getting at here is, in some ways, the conspiracy theory, maybe the reason why academics, you know, it's the least Foucauldian theory of power around. You know what I mean? Instead of it being like, it's really just, and maybe that's why academics don't like it. It's kind of the antithesis. It's just, if I get Hegelian, maybe it's like, you know, it's like the antithesis of Foucault coming to, you know, like maybe Pierre Bourdieu, you know, is a good person to think, because I'm a social scientist too. I like thinking with forces, thinking, you know, through things in terms of forces and structure, and not just like a few bad guys, and it's not just the agency of these specific people in power that made it happen. Like, I agree with Foucault, you know, in the sense that there are disciplinary regimes and institutional logics and things that people operate within that, you know, make things difficult. You can't just be like the one guy or the woman who goes and, you know, make something happen. And so it's fine to think of structures or forces, but, you know, there are other ways of thinking through that and ways that help us, I don't know, think of power in a way that might be more satisfying to working class people, to, you know, who and Pierre Bourdieu is great for that. Like Pierre Bourdieu, you know, he notices that, you know, like the classy people like to distinguish themselves as classy, you know, they like, it's not, it's that taste, the questions of taste are not about really the actual absolute value of the dish, the music, the dessert, the clothing. It's really about being able to show, you know, that you can afford and use certain kinds of music and food and clothing that signify like your ability to get like economically scarce goods. It's the fact that you can use this very scarce thing that actually makes it valuable. So it's you know, if you think you make fun of someone for listening to Bob Marley because, you know, you like Sister Nancy and that's cooler, you know, and maybe even more anti-racist because you really, you know, you know, it's mainstream crap, you know, you really did your history. Is it really, you know, is it really that Bob Marley is so bad? What am I doing when I'm making fun of someone for listening to Bob Marley? Is it really that they're, you know, there's something wrong with them, or am I trying to elevate myself and distinguish myself as having better taste, and what does that mean? And so in some ways, like, you know, and the point there is that the rich people that are doing this, the people with the good taste, you know, they don't they're not aware that they're doing this, you know, necessarily. Like they really do think, you know, that like this is great, you know, food, or this is great music and it's better than the other stuff, and they don't necessarily realize or are conscious when they're doing it that they're actually motivated by this logic of distinction and distinguishing themselves from others. And Bourdieu has this whole, yeah, I'm greatly simplifying Bourdieu, by the way, forgive me, but this is, you know, generally, and you have the idea that there's this misrecognition is something that's always going on with the people in privilege, and so maybe, you know, people in privilege are like misrecognizing the power that they do have in that same way, you know, that they have a lot of agency, they have a lot of power, they're doing a lot of things, you know, but they're managing the category of conspiracy theorists like in the same kind of way. Like the conspiracy theory, the conspiracy theorist becomes, you know, vulgar, just like hamburgers and pop music. It's like their knowledge and their theory of power is so very vulgar, you know, as opposed to the elite, refined, you know, nuanced theories of power that, you know, we distinguished superior intellectuals have. And so whether it's about the misrecognition about how they're managing conspiracy theory as a category to protect and manifest their own superiority and class respectability, or whether it's about how they're misrecognizing just the amount of power that they do have in the world as privileged people, I think Pierre Bourdieu is very useful here. And I feel like that if we want people to have and enjoy and use structural analyses of power more so than these kind of personalistic, voluntaristic, you know, theories of history, like conspiracy theories that we don't always like, we got to try and, you know, create structural analyses that are going to be compelling and interesting and not alienating and insulting to people in the working class. Like insofar as, you know, a lot of the, like I've been saying in a circular fashion, a lot of the cultural knowledge production in the academy that either comes from, you know, Foucault or bastardized versions of Foucault or not, is like, suggests the sort of innocence of people in professional positions because we're all locked in, gives a lot of agency to the oppressed people, and also sort of tends to want to, you know, there's an unfortunate tendency among a lot of social scientists to sort of, you know, humor the idea or promote the idea that a lot of the bad stuff that's happening in the world today, including things like capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy and all those big ones, is because of the malformed ideas and practices of people in the working class who need to be, told or otherwise changed so that they're not, bad or racist or sexist anymore, and then everything would be okay or something. And of course, people in the working class have all kinds of problematic ideas and practices. Yes, okay, we know, but and what about the malformed ideas and practices of people in the professional class? And what about a kind of structural, series of power that actually highlights the power that is being used and protected and maintained by people with class power? And how about looking, if you're a working class person, it's perfectly reasonable to see that as a conspiracy. I mean, in some ways, the entire bourgeoisie is a conspiracy. So there are, and in fact, going back to the last question about how to talk to my family member about whatever, this is
real quick, because we'll have to, we're kind of at time, we're over time. So if you want to wrap it up.
Just that's actually thinking back to that question, you can honor a lot of conspiracy theory people by being like, yeah, there is a conspiracy. It just looks a little different than the one you're talking about, I don't know.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. Conspiracy called capitalism.
Yeah, it's that same thing of connecting to where there is, I don't know, some shared truth in the feeling of what is happening, but then perhaps redirecting it to some of the analysis that is also attainable through YouTube videos, and it's on there as well. So well, great. We've still got, we're a little bit over time, but it seems like everybody has stayed. So I did want to give you just a quick opportunity to let folks know what's next for you. What can folks possibly expect from you in the future? There was one person who asked about that.
Well, quickly, I am trying my very hardest to finish the manuscript of Good Politics, Property, Intersectionality, and the Making of the Anarchist Self. I'm going to change the title. That was my dissertation. The Occult Features book comes from the first few chapters of that book. And I'm also going to work on, we'll give the link to that. In a moment, but I'll put a link actually in the chat to my page where you can see that if you're interested in it. That's an ethnography about multi-sided ethnography about collections in North America, Mexico, Quebec, the United States, and sort of anarchist solidarity activism with indigenous peoples movements in these different places and how they're all networked together. And it's a sort of critical look at anarcho-indigenism when promoted and manifested by settler allies, but it also in the process looks at how it kind of throws into relief the cultural idiosyncrasies of the Anglo-American, English-speaking left. And that sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier about anarchism being similar but different in different places. So what's considered good politics and good anarchist practice in the Anglo-American left is very specific to the Anglo-American left. And I look at what the reasons, I analyze, things about I get into safe space and a couple of controversial topics and look at how those things are culturally informed, and look at how the big sort of punchline or takeaways and looking at how these activists who do strive to be very anti-sexist and anti-racist and all the rest in all of their activities do end up sort of recuperating the Black feminist challenge of intersectionality within the realm of neoliberal self-making projects and property relations in a sort of unfortunate way in a lot of the activities that are meant to sort of improve the movement, like anti-oppression and a lot of things that are meant to kind of operationalize intersectionality in very well-intentioned ways, but can be very problematic. So that's what I'm working on. That's, as you can imagine, that's a big, touchy, heavy, difficult project, and so it's taken a while. And I do also hope to write something about, recently I was thinking I'm going to write something about anarchist knowledge production and how that is, how that's informed by the questions of that I raise in Occult Features about race and gender and stuff, how anarchism continues to be a historical and cultural product today. And I thought of using like the making of Occult Features of Anarchism as a book, as the kind of ethnographic case. I might piss off all my friends and editors and colleagues by doing so. So I might just, I'm not totally sure about this yet, but I also think, yeah, I think it would be great. So I'm gonna write a story of the making of the book, which is gonna kind of, yeah, lend weight to some of the things I say in the book. I don't know. That's what I'm working on.
Cool. That sounds fascinating, a continuation of very fascinating content. So if you've not yet picked up the book, I did drop a link there in the chat. Hope that you will. And Erica, thanks so much. Oh, you're gonna drop the other link there?
I'm just gonna put the link to my website, okay, which is under construction right now, so don't judge me, but the bibliography page of it is online, and so if you are interested in the other work I just mentioned, you can find it there. And the book that I'm writing, yeah, it's a long manuscript. It's not really ready yet, but if you're interested in what I just said about intersectionality and all that, and you want to get a sneak peek of that, there's a short, I wrote the Anthropology chapter in the Sage Handbook of Marxism, which is coming out later this year, and has a kind of, it's the shortest, most, digestible version of the good politics argument to date. It's like an 8,000 word piece, and it gives you a sense of what that's about in terms of intersectionality and neoliberalism and all that stuff. So, and you can find that right here. Okay.
Awesome.
That's all. Cool. Thank you, everybody. And oh, you know what? I'm gonna just hold on. I'm gonna write my email address too. Okay. Hold on. And now, if anyone has anything else they want to say or ask or whatever, feel free to just send me an email. I always like hearing from people. That would be my email. Okay, feel free, and thank you.
Cool. Yeah, and I can include that stuff in a follow-up email we'll send out to the attendees who
Sure. Feel free.
So yeah, Erica, thanks so much for this really thorough discussion. Thanks everyone who attended for your really engaging questions. And yeah, I don't know, maybe we can keep the conversation going, maybe not in virtual space, but perhaps in the future we can cross paths in person.
I would love to do a live book event. I'll come to your city, I'll fly, I'll risk multiple causes of death, I'll wear them. I'd love to come, and you could hear even just listening to the book event, like in freedom, like I was listening to it and thinking, oh, it's so much easier and nicer to speak when you see the audience and you can interact with them a little bit, and it's just so much better for all of us. So looking forward to being able to do that again. Yeah.
Well, I hope it can happen sooner rather than later.
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Erica.
Thank you, Ash. Thank you very much. Ciao.
Bye-bye now.